I want to tell you something about the moment before everything changed. Not the official version, not the one they broadcast on the Galactic Council feeds, the one with the clean timestamps and the committee-approved language and the spokespeople who had never actually been there. I mean the real version, the one I lived, the one that still wakes me up some nights, not from fear anymore, but from something I don't have a word for in Velhari. In your language, I think the closest thing is awe. But even that isn't quite right. Let me start where it actually started, which was not Earth, not yet. It was the edge of your solar system, in the dark past the last planet you call Neptune, in a place so empty and cold that even our sensors had trouble finding anything to latch onto. We had been traveling for a long time, longer than I want to say out loud, because when I say the number, people look at me differently. They look at the children on our fleet and do the math and their faces change. So let me just say, a long time. There were 412 ships in our convoy when we left the Velhari home cluster. By the time we reached the edge of your system, there were 289. I'll let you sit with that number for a moment. 289. The ones we lost, some to the Keth raiders who had been hunting us since the second month of our flight, some to equipment failures that no amount of jury-rigging could fix, some to illness, to despair, to things I still can't explain in any language. We were not a military fleet. We were not explorers or merchants or diplomats. We were families, farmers, teachers, archivists carrying data cores full of a civilization's entire memory because we knew that if we didn't, that memory would simply cease to exist. The Velhari home cluster is gone now. I don't mean abandoned, I mean gone. The Keth don't leave things standing. So we ran. We ran for longer than I have words for, and we lost more than I have tears for, and when our lead navigator, a woman named Aylin who had not slept properly in what felt like years, when she looked at her charts and said, "There is a system ahead. Small star, 9 planets, third one has atmosphere and liquid water and electromagnetic signals." The sound that went through our command deck was not cheering. It was weeping. Because we had heard this before. Twice before, we had found systems with signals. Twice before, we had sent approach messages and waited with our hearts in our throats, and twice before the answer had been the same. This space is claimed. Turn back or be fired upon. So when Aylin said, "electromagnetic signals," we wept. But it was the weeping of people who are terrified of hope, not people who have it. I sent the approach message myself. I was the vessel keeper, which in your terms is something like a captain mixed with a chaplain mixed with a record keeper. I was responsible for the fleet's communications. I wrote the message in 17 different formats: pulse wave, mathematical sequence, binary, tight beam audio, because we didn't know what these beings would understand. I wrote it honestly. I said who we were. I said what had happened to us. I said we were not a threat, that we had nothing left to threaten anyone with. I said we had children aboard. I said the number. Then I waited. The light travel time from our position to the third planet was approximately 4 hours. That meant 8 hours minimum before any response could reach us, assuming they answered immediately upon receiving our signal, which nothing in our experience suggested would happen. 8 hours is a very long time when you are drifting at the edge of a stranger's solar system. I didn't sleep. I don't think anyone did. The ships around us floated dark and quiet. We had reduced all non-essential power output because we didn't know what these beings' sensors could detect, and we didn't want to look threatening. From the outside, our fleet probably looked like debris. A cloud of broken, dark, barely functioning hulls tumbling in from interstellar space. Which, honestly, was not far from the truth. I remember sitting in the communication chair, which was less a chair than a padded alcove with sensor webbing that fed data directly into my nervous system. A Velhari interface design I always found slightly uncomfortable but incredibly efficient. I remember sitting there and watching the stars through the viewport. Your sun was just a bright star from that distance, slightly yellow. warm-looking, in the way that stars can look warm even when you know the science of what they are. I thought about my family. I thought about the ones we'd lost. I thought about a specific morning from my childhood. I must have been very young, maybe 4 or 5 in your years, when my mother took me to the coastal markets of our capital city. I remember the smell. I remember the light hitting the water. I remember that I dropped my food token in the mud and cried about it as though it was the worst thing that had ever happened. I thought about how I would give anything to go back to that morning. To be that small creature crying about a dropped food token in the mud while a whole world still existed around me. Then the communication array chimed. I almost didn't process it at first. It chimed and my mind was still back in that market, in that light, in that world that no longer existed, and then something in my chest lurched and I came back to the alcove, and to the sensor webbing, and to the deep cold dark at the edge of someone else's solar system, and I reached for the incoming signal with hands that were not quite steady. The response was in 17 different formats. They had received all 17 of our transmissions, and they had responded to all 17, simultaneously, in a coordinated reply that told me, before I had even parsed a single word of content, that whatever these beings were, they were not unsophisticated. The message was short. In the mathematical sequence format, it translated roughly as, "We receive you. We are processing. Do not approach closer than current position. You are not in danger from us. Acknowledge." That was it. That was the whole message. Do not approach. You are not in danger from us. I acknowledged. Then I sat very still for a long moment. Then I went and found Aylin and I grabbed her by both shoulders, which is not a thing we do casually in Velhari culture, physical contact like that. It's intimate. It means something, and I said, "They answered." She looked at me. Her eyes were terrible with hope. What did they say? They said, "We're not in danger." She made a sound I had never heard from her before or since. Then she leaned her forehead against mine. The Velhari gesture for "I am here, I am present, this is real." And we stayed like that for a moment that felt both very short and very long. Then she pulled back, straightened her uniform and went to her navigation station, because Aylin was that kind of person. She felt things deeply and completely, and then she put them away and went back to work, and I have always loved that about her. The next 8 hours were the longest of my life. More messages came. They were getting better at our language formats with each exchange. They were learning in real time, which was another thing that told me these beings were paying serious attention to us. By the 4th exchange, they were communicating in something that was close enough to standard Velhari mathematical notation that I could read it without the translation algorithms. They wanted to know about the Keth, how many ships, what armament class, last known position and bearing. That surprised me. I had expected questions about our population, our needs, our biological requirements. Questions that would tell us whether they had room for us, whether they were willing to help. Instead, they wanted tactical information. I answered as completely as I could. The Keth fleet that had been pursuing us, or what remained of it after we had managed to destroy 2 of their hunter ships in our 4th month of flight, was approximately 40 vessels, Keth standard configuration, which meant each one was roughly equivalent to a heavy assault cruiser by Galactic Council classification. They had broken off pursuit when we crossed into what the Council charts marked as unclaimed space, but that didn't mean much. The Keth didn't always respect Council charts. I sent the information, then I waited. The response came faster than I expected, given the light travel time. They must have had relay systems I wasn't accounting for. It was simple, just 2 lines. "Understood, we are coming to you. Please maintain position." And then a number, a count. When I saw the count, I read it 3 times because I was certain I was misreading it. Then I called Aylin. Then I called every department head on the flagship and every captain equivalent on every ship in our convoy, because if I was misreading it, I wanted witnesses, and if I wasn't misreading it, I wanted witnesses even more. The count was the number of vessels they were sending to meet us. Not 2, not 10, not even the 50 or 60 that might have seemed like a reasonable protective escort for a refugee convoy in a contested region. They were sending 4,311 ships. 4,000. For us. A convoy of wounded, exhausted civilian refugees who had asked for shelter. They were sending 4,000 ships. I need to stop here for a moment and explain something about the Galactic Council and how spacefaring civilizations typically work, because without that context, you might not understand what 4,000 ships means. The Galactic Council, and I know your people have complicated feelings about the Council now, feelings I think are largely justified, but the Galactic Council at that time represented 43 recognized civilizations. 43 species who had achieved interstellar travel and been formally welcomed into what passed for galactic civilization. The Council had a combined defensive fleet of approximately 12,000 vessels. 12,000 ships, across 43 civilizations, over multiple star systems, covering an area of space that takes years to cross. The humans who were not at that point members of the Council, who had been, in fact, formally classified as a developing world per-contact quarantine observation status, meaning the Council knew you existed and had decided not to interact with you yet, mostly because you seemed volatile and your technology was, by Council standards, quite primitive. The humans were sending 4,000 ships. Not their entire fleet. We would learn later it was not their entire fleet. This was, as I would come to understand, a very human thing to do. When humans decide something is important, they do not send what is adequate. They send what is unmistakable. I saw the first human ships when they were still far enough away that they appeared on sensors rather than through viewports, which, given the size of your solar system, was still a significant distance. The sensor reads came in and I sat looking at them, and I found that my mouth had gone dry. They were not what I had expected. I had expected, I think, something like Council ships. Council naval architecture tends towards certain shared principles: smooth hulls, elegant lines, weapon systems integrated subtly into the body of the vessel, a certain aesthetic that values looking non-threatening even when you are extremely threatening. It is a design philosophy born from 10,000 years of diplomacy and careful posturing. Human ships looked like they had been designed by someone who had never heard of looking non-threatening and didn't particularly care to learn. They were enormous. The largest ones, the ones I would later learn were called carriers, which is a word that undersells them catastrophically, were structures of such scale that my sensors had to recalibrate twice before I trusted the readings. They bristled. That's the only word. They bristled with weapons systems, sensor arrays, communication dishes, point defense batteries, things I couldn't even identify, everything external and visible and deliberate, as if the design philosophy had been: we want anyone looking at this ship to immediately understand exactly how many ways it can end their day. And yet, there was also something about them that wasn't purely aggressive. The carrier-class ships had these running lights, amber and white, arranged in patterns along the hull edges that gave them, in the darkness of space, a quality almost like warmth, like enormous lanterns, like something designed not just to project power, but to be seen from far away by someone who needed to see them. The formation they were traveling in was also not what I expected. I had expected military order, tight columns, perfect spacing, the kind of rigid geometric arrangement that says, look how disciplined we are. Instead, they came in a shape that I stared at for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. They were arranged in a wide arc, curved, open at the front. Like cupped hands. Like something reaching out to catch. One of our younger crew members, a boy named Tessari, maybe 15 in your years, who had been born on the fleet and had never known anything but running. Tessari was looking at the sensor display over my shoulder and he said, very quietly, "What are they doing?" I looked at that formation. I thought about the shape of it. I thought about the message they'd sent. "We are coming to you." "I think," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, "I think they're coming to pick us up." They reached our position in what felt like no time at all, though that's partly because the last few hours before contact I spent in a state of such suspended, breathless tension that time stopped working the way it usually does. I was at the communication station. My whole body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency just above normal. The first human vessel to make direct contact with our flagship was not a warship. It was something they called a diplomatic courier, smaller, faster, built for communication rather than combat. It pulled alongside our flagship with a smoothness that spoke of extraordinary pilot skill, which I appreciated because our hull was not in great shape and any accidental contact would have been very bad. Then there was a docking request, a formal one, polite, with a full translation in our mathematical format. They wanted to send a delegation aboard. We said yes. Of course we said yes. Though I remember there was a brief, heated discussion among the department heads about whether we should be worried, whether this was some kind of trap, whether we were being naive. And I remember Aylin cutting through it with characteristic efficiency. She said, "They sent 4,000 ships to protect people they've never met. If they wanted to trap us, they would just have let the Keth finish the job." Then she walked away, and that was the end of the discussion. The delegation was 4 people. I have thought about this many times since. They sent 4,000 ships, and 4 people walked through our airlock. I asked one of them about it later, a woman named Commander Yates, who had short dark hair and the kind of eyes that seemed to be processing approximately 6 things simultaneously. I asked her about the disproportion and she shrugged, which is a very human gesture I find difficult to interpret even now. She said, 4,000 ships is for the Keth. 4 people is for you. We didn't want to overwhelm you." She said it so simply, like it was obvious. 4,000 for the threat, 4 for the people, calibrated down to the person. I think about that sometimes. The 4 of them came through the airlock in full environment suits. They weren't sure about our atmosphere and they weren't taking risks, and they stood in our docking bay and looked around at us. We were crowded in there. 20 or 30 crew who had all found reasons to be near the airlock, which was not a coincidence. We had been alone and afraid for so long that the sight of other beings, any beings who were not trying to kill us, was something we needed to be close to. Commander Yates pulled back her helmet seal so we could see her face. She looked at us for a moment. I don't know what she saw. I can only imagine a crowd of Velhari, which means being somewhat taller than humans, with the 4-fingered hands and the secondary eyelids and the light-sensitive skin that shifts colors slightly with strong emotion. And most of us probably looked exhausted and frightened and achingly, desperately hopeful. She said something in your language that the universal translation rendered as, "You're safe now." That was it, 2 words in the original, "You're safe." The Velhari word for what happened in that room, there isn't a human equivalent that I've found. The closest is something like the sound a held breath makes when it finally releases. It is not a peaceful sound. It is complicated and ragged and full of everything that was being held. It is not beautiful exactly, but it is real. It is the sound of people who had stopped believing in certain things beginning, very carefully, to believe in them again. I am not embarrassed to tell you that I was one of the people making that sound. The next several hours were logistics, which sounds mundane, but was in fact one of the most remarkable things I have ever witnessed. The humans had clearly planned this. They had received our fleet inventory, we'd sent it in our communications, populations, resource needs, structural damage reports, and they had arrived prepared. Not somewhat prepared, not reasonably prepared. They had a hospital ship for every 12 vessels in our convoy. Full medical facilities. staffed with people who had spent the transit time studying Velhari biology from the biological data we'd transmitted, which they had apparently shared across their entire medical corps in the days between our first contact and their departure. They did not know everything, they couldn't have in that time, but they knew the critical points. Velhari physiology, the things that could kill us quickly if they got it wrong, the things we could survive without. They had food synthesizers loaded with Velhari-compatible nutrients, approximate, not perfect, but enough. They had shelter ships, enormous vessels whose cargo bays had been converted into temporary habitation. They had engineers who came aboard our damaged vessels with equipment I'd never seen, who looked at systems that I had been nursing along with hope and wire and prayers to whatever remained of my faith, and they didn't promise anything, they just started working. I watched one of their engineers, a young man, couldn't have been more than 25 in your years, with the kind of calm intensity that suggested he had been doing this since before he was old enough to be doing this. I watched him look at our main power coupling, which had been fractured in a Keth attack 7 months previous, and had been running at 60% since then, which meant our life support had been running at 60%, which meant it had been cold on our flagship. Cold in a way that you get used to, and then you don't get used to, and then you just live inside of it like a kind of permanent ache. He looked at it for about 45 seconds. Then he turned to his partner, a woman who was carrying a toolkit that looked like it weighed as much as she did, and he said something fast in your language that the translation rendered only partially, something like tertiary bypass, reinforce the main node, reroute through the secondary array. 90 minutes later, our power coupling was running at 93%. I didn't know what to say. I found I couldn't actually say anything. I just stood there being warm, actually warm, for the first time in months, and I looked at this young man who had fixed in 90 minutes something we'd been limping along on for 7 months, and he looked back at me, and he said, very casually, "You'll want to get that secondary array replaced when you have time. I patched it, but it's going to give you trouble again." Just like that, get it replaced when you have time, as if having time was a normal thing, as if the future was something that just happened and you could plan for it. It was such a small thing, he said. I thought about it for days. The Keth came on the 3rd day. I think, looking back, they must have been tracking us even after they broke off pursuit, waiting to see what kind of reception we'd receive, whether whatever beings lived in this system would turn us away, or whether they'd be too primitive to be worth worrying about, whether there would be an opportunity. There were 63 ships in the Keth force, more than we'd seen in the initial pursuit group. They'd called in reinforcements, either from somewhere nearby, or they'd always had them and had been holding them back, waiting for a moment. 63 ships is not a small number. By Galactic Council standards, 63 Keth warships represented a significant military action. There were species in the Council who didn't have 63 warships total. I was in the command bay when the proximity alert sounded. I felt my chest seize. We all did, everyone who'd been in that pursuit, who'd lost people to those ships, who had spent months hearing that alert and knowing it meant we were about to run or fight and possibly die. The alert had become a sound we associated with the worst moments of our lives, and hearing it, even now, even here, sent us all backward into that fear like stepping into cold water. Commander Yates was on our command deck. She'd been spending a lot of time there, partly for liaison purposes and partly, I think, because she found our systems interesting. She heard the alert. She looked at the display. She looked at the Keth formation, 63 ships, fanning out into attack configuration, which I recognized immediately because I had seen it before in the worst months. Then she reached for her communication device and said, in a tone that I can only describe as professionally relaxed, "Yates to Fleet Actual. We have 63 Keth hostiles entering the AO. Standard intercept, please. Keep them away from the civilian ships," she paused, "and get me Admiral Chen." That was all. "Standard intercept, please." I want you to understand what I was looking at on my display at that moment. 63 Keth warships. I had seen what those ships could do. I had the memory of everything they had cost us carved somewhere permanent in me. Commander Yates said, "Please." The human fleet began to move. I've tried many times to describe what I saw, and I'm never satisfied with it. Because what I saw was something that doesn't fit neatly into words. 4,311 ships, minus the hospital ships and shelter ships and engineering vessels that maintained position to protect our convoy. So somewhere around 3,600 combat-configured human vessels moving into intercept formation. They moved fast, faster than anything that size had a right to move. And they moved together with a coordination that was almost unsettling, the way a flock of birds moves together, where you can't quite see the communication but you know it's happening, constant and instantaneous, every individual vessel knowing exactly what the whole needs. The Keth formation hesitated. I know the Keth. I had studied them out of necessity. I knew their tactical doctrine. They did not typically hesitate. They were aggressive, overwhelming force preferred, not particularly sophisticated in their approach, but extremely effective through sheer mass and brutal efficiency. They had been hunting refugee convoys for decades. They had never, in my knowledge, hesitated. They hesitated now. I think watching it on the sensors, watching the Keth formation slow and shift and reconfigure uncertainly, I think they had expected something much smaller, something that would negotiate or bluster or perhaps fight defensively, something with limits, something that would weigh the cost of confrontation and decide the calculation didn't favor full engagement. They had not expected this. They had not done their intelligence on humanity. Or if they had, their intelligence was 3 years out of date, because 3 years ago what I was looking at would not have been possible. But humans, and I say this with full sincerity, having now spent years among you, humans in the face of an existential crisis do not slow down. They accelerate. They work with a kind of frantic, focused, almost alarming intensity. And in the years before we arrived, they had apparently decided that the galaxy was a complicated and dangerous place, and they should be prepared for it. They had been very thorough about preparing. The Keth made contact, a tight beam communication directed at the human fleet, not at us. They didn't even address us directly anymore. The translation came through our systems, rough but legible. The Keth commander was saying something about rights of pursuit, something about refugee property, which was a term they actually used, property, and I felt the old rage move through me like electricity. Something about this being outside council jurisdiction. Admiral Chen responded. I had not yet met Admiral Chen at this point. I would meet her later, and she is, a remarkable person, small and quiet in the way that some very precise things are quiet. She has a way of looking at a problem that reminds me of that young engineer looking at our power coupling. 45 seconds of looking, then total certainty about exactly what needs to be done. Her response to the Keth commander was recorded in our archive. I will tell you what it said, not precisely in her words, but as closely as I can render it. She said, "These people came to us for shelter. They are under our protection. You have 60 seconds to change your heading or we will change it for you. This is not a negotiation. This is a notice. Clock starts now." Nothing else. 60 seconds. I remember looking at Commander Yates. She was watching the display with her arms crossed and an expression I didn't know how to read yet. I've learned since. It was the expression of someone who already knows how something ends. The Keth commander responded. Something about the scale of what they were looking at, something, I think, about calling this aggression, about reporting it to the council. There was, in the tone of the communication, something I had never heard from a Keth commander before. Something that sounded like uncertainty. Admiral Chen said, 50 seconds. She continued the countdown. Every 10 seconds, 40 seconds, 30, just the number. Nothing added to it. No threats, no elaboration, no emotional language. Just the number getting smaller with the full weight of 3,600 ships behind it. At 15 seconds, the Keth formation began to alter heading. Not quickly enough. At 10 seconds, they were still not clear, and I saw the human fleet's forward elements begin their targeting configurations. Weapons systems cycling up in a way that our sensors couldn't miss, and the Keth sensors certainly couldn't miss. At 5 seconds, the Keth broke formation entirely. Not a tactical withdrawal, a rout. 63 ships scattering in multiple directions, not coordinated, not controlled, running. Individually, each one for itself. Admiral Chen said, 1. She did not fire. The Keth ran. The silence in our command bay lasted a long time. Then Tessari, the 15-year-old who had been born on the fleet and had never known anything but running, he let out this sound. This one broken, overwhelmed, completely genuine sound, like something cracking open and the light getting in. I looked at Commander Yates. She was still watching the display, but her arms had dropped to her sides and her expression had changed. She looked tired and relieved, and something else I didn't have a category for yet. She noticed me looking. "They won't be back," she said. "Not those ones." "How do you know?" She thought for a moment. "The first time you make something that big turn and run, it takes something out of them." She paused. "We'll keep a watch, but they're done." She said it with a certainty that I wanted to believe, and as it turned out, I was right to believe it. Part 2. What your world looked like from the dark. We made the transit to your inner system over the course of 11 days. I want to tell you about those 11 days because I don't think they get talked about enough. The official history talks about the first contact protocols and the council negotiations, and the political situation that developed in the months following. All of that is important. But the 11 days of transit, those are what I actually lived. The human fleet surrounded us the entire time, not surrounding us the way guards surround a prisoner, surrounding us the way I'm trying to find the right comparison, like the way you might walk next to someone who is injured, positioning yourself on the side nearest traffic. Present, solid, oriented toward any threat, but not pressing, not overwhelming, just there. Every ship in our convoy had a human escort vessel. Not hovering right beside us, they gave us space, kept a respectful distance, but close enough that we could see them on visual if we looked out the viewports. And we looked, almost constantly, I think. I would walk through the civilian decks of the flagship, where the families were, the non-crew, the people who had been passengers since the beginning, and I would see people standing at viewports just watching the human ship that was keeping pace with us. Just watching it, not saying anything, just needing to see it. Children would press their faces against the viewport glass. Tessari took younger children there deliberately, I found out later, sat with them and pointed out the human ship and explained what it was doing and why it was there. I don't know exactly what he told them. I know that after those conversations, they slept better. Some of them slept through the night for the first time in months or years, or, in the case of the very youngest, the ones born on the fleet, the first time in their lives. On the 4th day of transit, the human ship started doing something that none of us had asked for and none of us expected. They began transmitting. Not communications, not messages for us to read or decode. Music. They were broadcasting music on frequencies we could pick up, aimed generally outward, and when our systems caught it and brought it through the speakers in the civilian decks, people stopped where they were and listened. It was human music. We didn't know any of it, couldn't have, but music, it turns out, doesn't entirely require shared cultural context. Rhythm travels, harmony carries. There was one piece. I still don't know what it was called. I've tried to find it and failed. It might have been something original, composed for this moment specifically. There was one piece that was slow and wide and felt like open space, like the particular quality of light in the early part of a day. And when it came through the speakers in the family corridor, I watched a woman I knew, a woman who had lost her mate 8 months into our flight, to a Keth weapons strike, and who had not. In the 11 months since made a sound that wasn't functional. I watched her stop walking, stand still, lift her face, and cry. Not in the way she'd cried before, the controlled, private, silent weeping she'd been doing in the dark. She cried out loud publicly, standing in the corridor, and several people around her moved toward her, not to stop her, just to be near her, just to let her know there were witnesses. I think she needed to cry out loud. I think she had been keeping it inside so long that it had become a kind of weight, and something about the music created permission, the way music can do. Afterward she found me. She said, "What kind of people make music and send it to strangers?" I didn't have an answer. I've thought about it many times since. On the 7th day, we saw Earth for the first time. Not close up, we were still too far for visual detail. But it was visible as a distinct disk on high magnification sensors, and when the image came up on the command bay display, people gathered. I think almost every crew member found a reason to be in the command bay. I had been told in the messages exchanged during the transit some basic facts about Earth, population, geography, basic political structure, which was complicated and which I would spend the next year working hard to understand. I knew intellectually what I was looking at. Knowing intellectually is different from seeing. It was blue, mostly. Blue-white, with the white being cloud cover and the blue being water. Your surface is mostly water. Enormous oceans. The ratio of water to land is something we knew from our bioscans, but actually seeing it, the blue of it was something else. We don't have that on Velhar, didn't have it. Velhar was a drier world. We had water but not abundance, not this casual, ridiculous abundance of water that a species surrounded by it might learn to take for granted. Looking at Earth from space and seeing that color, that blue that goes all the way to the horizon, and then there's more of it. One of our water engineers made a sound that I'd describe as involuntary, like she'd been punched gently in the chest. She said, "Is that all?" "Yes," said Commander Yates, who had been watching us look at her planet with an expression I was only beginning to learn to read. She had a slight smile. Quiet. The smile of someone watching a thing they know is significant and choosing not to explain it, just letting you have the moment unmediated. "It's all water." "Not all of it. Roughly 70%. The water engineer said something that the translation failed on entirely. I think it was an expression of shock that existed only in Velhari, because the concept of 70% surface water coverage requires a specific cultural context to produce. Commander Yates must have gotten the general meaning from the tone, though, because her quiet smile deepened slightly. "We sometimes forget how much of it there is," she said. "Looking at it from here helps." I looked at her looking at her planet. Something about that image, a person looking at their home from the outside, understanding it in a new way because a stranger was seeing it for the first time, something about that stuck with me. "You love it," I said, not a question. She thought about it, which I had come to understand was something she did, actually considered things before she responded rather than just saying the first available thing. "I don't think I fully understood how much until the last 2 weeks, she said. "The last 2 weeks, since you came for us." She nodded slowly. "I stored that moment, I have it still." We entered orbit on the 10th day. There is a specific moment when a ship crosses from approach trajectory into stable orbit, a shift in the quality of motion, a settling, a change in the pull of whatever world you're now bound to. On our flagship, when we crossed that threshold and the navigation display confirmed we were in orbit, there was a cheer. It came from somewhere in the civilian decks. I couldn't tell exactly where, and then spread. And then it wasn't really a cheer anymore. It was too various and complicated for that word. It was a sound that a community makes when something happens that they had given up expecting would ever happen. We were in orbit. Not running, not transiting, not hiding in dark space at the edge of someone else's system. In orbit. Around a living world, with a star that was warm and near enough to feel through the hull, with water below us in quantities that seemed almost mythological, with a planet that people apparently lived on and had always lived on and would go on living on, a world that existed in the most permanent way any world can exist, which is the way of things that have not been destroyed. I sat in the command bay and looked at the planet turning below us, and I let myself feel it for the first time. Really feel it. Because I had been holding everything at arm's length since we'd made contact, afraid to let it be real, afraid that if I let it be real and it turned out not to be, the crash would be unsurvivable. But there was the planet. Blue and white and brown and green, turning in the light of your star. It was real. The formal meetings began on day 11, and I need to tell you about this part honestly, which means I need to tell you that it was not perfect, and humanity was not perfect, and not every voice was the same. Because here is the thing about a species that is as varied as yours. You contain everything. I had met Commander Yates and Admiral Chen and the young engineer, and the people who had transmitted music to strangers, and I had formed some impressions. But those impressions were not the whole picture. Nothing is ever the whole picture. There were people on your planet who didn't want us. Not many, not a majority, nothing like that, but some. People who were afraid. People who had questions about what we would need, what we would cost, what we would change. People who said in various formulations, how do we know? Which is a fair question, actually. How do you know when strangers arrive from space who they are? I attended some of those discussions. Not all of them. Many happened in your governing structures that I didn't have direct access to, but some. And I want to tell you what I noticed. The humans who disagreed, the ones with concerns, the ones who were afraid, they were argued with. In public forums, in council chambers, through your media systems, through the relentless and sometimes uncomfortable machinery of your public discourse. They were not silenced. They were engaged. People brought evidence, brought testimony, brought the data from our fleet transmissions, brought arguments. Some minds changed. Some didn't. The process was messy in a way that made some of my fellow Velhari uncomfortable, because we tend toward more hierarchical decision-making, where a question like this would have been decided by a council of elders and the decision would have been handed down. Your way is noisier. It is slower in some ways, but I watched it and I thought, this system was built for exactly this. For the moments when something hard and important has to be decided, and it has to be decided by more than one person's wisdom, because any one person's wisdom can be wrong. The decision that came out of that process, to grant us temporary sanctuary, to begin negotiations for longer-term settlement, to provide humanitarian resources for as long as needed. That decision had weight to it because it had been contested, because people had fought for it and fought against it, and it had survived both. I respected that. I told Commander Yates I respected it, and she looked at me with an expression that was both pleased and a little surprised, like she hadn't expected the compliment from that direction. We're not always proud of the process, she said. You should be, I told her. It is harder than what most species do, and you choose it anyway. She thought about that for a long time. Part 3. Learning your word for what you are. We lived in orbit for 6 weeks while the details were worked out. Then they brought us down. Not all of us, not all at once, 289 ships, and their populations, organized in careful waves, assigned to temporary settlements that had been prepared across 6 of your continents. I learned later the scale of the logistical operation that had happened on your surface while we were in transit, the coordination across dozens of countries, the resources mobilized, the temporary cities constructed with a speed that apparently astounded even experienced human logistics coordinators. I was in the third wave. They brought me down in a shuttle, a human shuttle, because our own landers were not in reliable condition, and I sat strapped into a seat that had clearly been adapted for Velhari proportions, with a viewport on my left, and I watched as we descended through your atmosphere. I had been in planetfall hundreds of times. I had been born on a planet, had spent my childhood and early adulthood on it, had taken for granted the casual miracle of standing on solid ground under an open sky. And then I had been in space for so long that the fact of a planet existing below me had become a theoretical thing. The shuttle broke through the cloud layer. There was land below, green. Green in a way that I was not prepared for. We had seen the colors from orbit, but from orbit you understand them intellectually. From inside the cloud layer coming through, seeing the ground rush up toward you, seeing green that went on and on and on, fields and forests and things I didn't even have names for yet. The human pilot, a young woman who had been politely professional throughout the descent, she glanced back at me. She must have seen something in my face. She said, "First time." I managed to say yes. She turned back to her instruments, but she did something then. She slowed the descent. Not by much, not enough to inconvenience anything. Just enough to give me more time with that viewport, more time with that green, more time descending through the air of a living world that was not, for once, burning. I don't know if she did it deliberately or if it was something else. I like to think she did it deliberately. I think it was that kind of thing that was easy to dismiss as coincidence but was actually just care. Small care. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The settlement they had prepared for our group was in a region called, I'll use the name as it was given to me, a valley in what you call New Zealand, which is a collection of islands in your southern ocean. I was told they chose it partly for the climate, which was mild and wet in a way that was similar to Velhari's temperate zones, and partly because the land was available, and partly, I suspected, because it was beautiful. When we came off the shuttle ramp and stood on actual ground, actual dirt, actual grass under our feet, actual open sky above, I watched the people around me and I stored every face. There was a woman from our fleet, a retired schoolteacher named Orath, who must have been 60 or 70 in your years old for a Velhari, a person who had spent her whole adult life teaching, and who had spent the last 2 years teaching children on the fleet, in corridors and cargo bays, under dim lighting, surrounded by fear, teaching because children need to learn even when everything is wrong. She stepped off the shuttle ramp and she crouched down and she put both hands flat on the grass. Just held them there. Her eyes were closed. I didn't say anything to her, I just watched. After a long time, she opened her eyes and looked up at me. Her skin had shifted to the soft amber gold that means deep emotion in Velhari coloring. She said, "It's warm." The ground, it was warm from the sun. She said, "I forgot ground could be warm." I didn't trust my voice to respond.